On my very last day of work, which I had no idea was, I had just gotten off a call with a client doing some grief support, and I experienced a really massive seizure sitting at my desk. And it was my body's way of saying, Angie, stop. Like, you are absorbing the pain and suffering of other people. You don't have the support system in place for yourself. You're in an environment where just not getting the support that you need.
Hey there, I am Dr. Jason Balara, and this is the Know Your Why podcast, where we explore the why behind success. Every week, I meet with real estate investors, veterinary entrepreneurs, mindset coaches, authors, and fitness professionals to uncover their why and how it drives them on the winding road to success. What is your why? Hi everyone, I'm Jason Balara, and this is the Know Your Why podcast. Today I'm here with Angie Arora, founder of Arora Wellness. She helps animal care organizations and its people bridge the gap between the stressors of high trauma animal care work and the skills needed to mitigate their impact. So, Angie, as I mentioned, your bio is very fascinating, but I think it's going to be far more interesting to hear it from you in your words. But first, I just want to say thank you. Thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for taking the time out this morning. I'm really excited to talk about a topic that I know well, and a lot of my friends and colleagues know well. So, as I mentioned, it's a little outside of what we maybe most frequently talk about on this podcast, but I've definitely had other people from the veterinary and animal care world. So I'm really excited. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Can we start with you just telling us about yourself, about your background, kind of what brought you to where you are today?
Yeah, for sure. So I am what's called a veterinary social worker, but I feel like to make that make sense, I'm going to start back to the beginning parts of the journey. So I'm going to take us back over 20 years, and I promise I won't unpack the entire 20 years. 2004 was a really pivotal year for me. It was that year that I was finishing up my master's of social work. I had an idea of what I wanted to do with my career. That time I thought I was going to do a lot of work around women's rights and gender-based violence work. And although that did happen, there was, life. And it threw me a little bit of a curveball. And as I was finishing up my master's of social work, my first, your first soul love dog, the one that just touches you like no one else has ever touched you before. He was at that time about 18 years old and had been just very recently diagnosed with bone cancer. And I had taken a little bit of time off of my master's of social work to support him in his final days and weeks. And he ended up passing away in my arms. And for me, although I had experienced some loss before, I was not prepared for the nature of this particular loss and what it did to me. And so it was kind of like these two worlds combined in that time period where I just had this light bulb moment for me, which was I am experiencing so much pain and suffering and depths of grief in losing Monty. And I said, I'm also being trained as a social worker. What if I put those two things together? And what if I allowed myself to use some of my training and my lived experience to maybe support other people? And that really started off this journey. And at that time, I had no idea that there was this thing called veterinary social work. I didn't realize that until a few years later. So the formative years of my career were really spent around supporting others who were either anticipating the loss of their animal companions or had experienced the loss. And fast forward a few years into 2008, I landed myself a job as a grief counselor inside of an animal hospital that had 3 locations. So I was sort of rotating amongst 3. I think it's almost important to pause for a moment and recognize this was the year 2008. It was a long time ago. The way that we talk about pet loss today is not how we were talking about it back then. So for this hospital to jump on the opportunity was quite cutting edge. But that was another turning point for me because I had never worked in an animal hospital before. I had worked in nonprofits. It was a bit of a rude awakening to me, the dynamics of the stress, the pace of the environment, the way in which people sort of related to each other, it was really different from what I was used to. And I think I lasted in that role for maybe about a year to a year and a half. And there was a whole lot of compounding factors, but I experienced what I now know to be secondary traumatic stress. And I share this as a really open part of my journey. But on my very last day of work, which I had no idea was, I had just gotten off a call with a client doing some grief support, and I experienced a really massive seizure sitting at my desk. And it was my body's way of saying, Angie, stop. Like, you are absorbing the pain and suffering of other people. You don't have the support system in place for yourself. You're in an environment where you're just not getting the support that you need. And it made it really hard for me to just kind of keep carrying on the way that I had. But that might have been the greatest gift in my entire career, because that is what got me interested into understanding what is the nature of stress and exposure to trauma that folks in this field are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, but we're not really using that language to describe it. And what are those accumulating compounding impacts of what are high stress, high trauma exposed workplaces? And so for the last however many years, that is the area that I've really been passionate about, and supporting not just those working within hospital settings, but really any type of animal care work. So if I fast forward to today, my three biggest clients, like I support employees within organizations, are an animal hospital, an animal shelter, but also a zoo. And I've come to see that that nature of high stress, high trauma exposure really runs through any type of animal care organization.
Yeah, yeah. It's fascinating and interesting to see that it seems like your start into this was client facing. Right? You
Yeah.
were, I guess grief support is probably an oversimplification, but it's what and I mean that's a very real part of what veterinarians do literally on a daily basis. There's euthanasia is a I think personally I think is a good thing that we're able to do that, but also it's hard and it's not always for the right reasons, and so there's different scenarios, but but it is my point being it is something that veterinarians deal with literally every day and often end up being that grief support for the clients, and it's or the client doesn't want to be there and you're the last person that the pet gets held in their arms, I guess, if you will, or gets
Yeah.
pets them on the head. And what's wonderful about the veterinary community and animal care in general is that those are the people that they'll do it. They'll sit. If the owner can't be there, they will. I've seen it. I've seen it. I've seen it myself. I've been in those rooms. I've been there with when there's five techs will come in and just sit and give an animal some treats and all of that, and just really be their family, for their final moments. And it's yeah, it's interesting to me that you've kind of worked with people on both sides of that equation, and I think it's absolutely needed. And euthanasia, I think, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about this, but I'm sure euthanasia is not the only
Mm.
uh, source of this, trauma and stress that you describe, because when you're if that's what you're dealing with on the client side of things, certainly it's not the only stress that they encounter, but that's a big piece of it, at least in my experience. But if you're now working directly with the animal caregivers, I'm sure you've encountered and unpacked a whole bunch of other
Mm.
pieces of that. So maybe let's start there. Maybe let's talk about kind of what things, what categories sounds like it's making it too too scientific, but I'm sure that there's a few major things that you see that
Mhm.
point to as the causes of those traumas and stresses?
Yeah, and I think sometimes though a frame is really helpful, right? To kind of take the complexity of everything and help it make sense. If I was to narrow down, and this is like still a vague narrowing down, and we can go even deeper if we want to, but I think the stress and some of the trauma exposure in my mind rests in like what I call four buckets. And the one that you and I just talked about is the grief bucket. And so, the exposure to the losses of animals, the anticipated losses, and obviously, depending on the setting that people are working in, that looks really different if we're talking about a shelter versus a hospital versus a zoo. But the other three, and this might sound really simplistic, but I would tell you in the vast majority of people that I work with, it's the working conditions that are leading to burnout, which is the number one challenge. And if you want to break that down even more, not feeling like I've got control or agency over the work that I'm doing. And I'm often just kind of put in a position of having to make ends meet or not understanding why I'm being asked to do certain things in the workplace. And, sometimes that can also include lack of staffing or inappropriate staffing. And so we
Mhm.
know that workloads can be really, really hectic. We've got lots of people, as you know better than anyone, that their personal life is so significantly impacted by not being able to leave work on time or not being able to even emotionally and psychologically leave the pressures of the work. I mean, that's its own bucket on how we've created workplaces that are really taking people and turning their nervous systems into these chronic states of overdrive where people are having a really hard time for good reason, either fully shutting off when they get home, or I'd say the majority of the people that I support are crashing and burning when they get home because they've expended this incredible amount of energy while at work that there's nothing much left to give for themselves, their children, their partners, their
Yeah.
communities when it's all said and done. And I know that sounds really oversimplistic, but I cannot emphasize how much that is showing up in the work that I'm doing with people. That's obviously not veterinary specific. I mean, we know that burnout and high stress environments are kind of just endemic right now. It's in most professions and industries, but it is a hot topic here, right? There's no
Yeah.
doubt. And I think the second bucket is one that we don't talk enough about, which is moral distress. And so here, if I was to describe it really, really simply, and this also comes up a lot, regardless of which type of organization I'm working with, it's like I know what my values are. I know what's important to me. I know the type of care and quality of care I want to provide this animal. I know the type of quality care I want to provide to the human clients, but there's these things that are getting in the way of me being able to act in accordance with my values. So if you think of it from the client side, what's the number one thing we hear all the time? Financial limitations,
We're charging too much. Yeah.
right? And
The,
that misunderstanding, I think, as well of why
yeah.
things are charged the way they are.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to back up to the thing that you said about the energy expenditure
Mm,
because I don't I don't know if I've ever heard anybody put it in a way that resonated with me so much. Like the amount and I think like I mostly because I've never heard it put that way, but it's the energy that is put out by the teams like and I would I mean the doctors too but like the technicians on a daily basis like they don't stop like you mentioned
yeah.
understaffing. I don't i don't really know that I know what correct staffing looks like because every hospital I've ever been in is understaffed, like literally every single
Yeah.
one, and it's nobody's ever staffed to where they should be to be able to maintain people's quality of like work environment because of the second thing that you just said where clients expect us to do our jobs for free. And so if you hire the right and I shouldn't even say it that way, not just clients,
Mm,
within the industry, we expect each other to do things for free. And so
mm,
it's an oversimplification of that. But the point is, nobody wants to charge what should be charged for medical care. And so therefore they can't provide appropriate staffing in the hospitals. They can't give the technicians the raises that they deserve. Like it all trickles down, right? It's at the end of the day, it's a business. It's a business like any other business, and it happens to be a medical business where we care for animals, but it's
mm,
still, in order to keep doing that, it is a business. So the amount of energy that gets expended is, when you said that, I just was like, all of a sudden this like list in
mm,
my head started churning, where it's like, yeah, they don't sit down. They oftentimes don't get a lunch, or a proper lunch
yeah,
break, or a proper snack. It
yeah,
oftentimes it's like, here's a box of donuts. Keep going. We got a busy day, and it's like you can survive on that for the day. Um,
yeah,
and that's
yeah.
not unusual. Like, and I've done it, and frankly, I've probably uh, fostered that type of day at times, when I'm like, we have a lot of
Mm,
surgeries today. I bought you guys some donuts and pizza. Can you keep going? Like, and it's, but
yeah,
and people keep going, and they deal with the physical, just doing this, over and over. The
mm,
I guess, intellectual energy that it takes, right? Like, we are
yeah,
practicing medicine, right? So it's like, you've got, this isn't a thing where you can like half-ass it and get your drug dosages wrong. This is, in my world, we're doing surgery, we're anesthetizing animals. Like, it's, you
yeah,
can't, be, distracted. You can't be kind of off your game. Like, that's how problems happen. And so, true physical energy, true intellectual energy of just like, your brain has to work accurately and quickly. And then
mm,
the emotional stress of it, like the emotional energy of, we're
mhm,
caring for these animals. What if something doesn't go right? What if you have an angry
yeah,
client? And like, the staff in the hospitals, and I don't, I know you mentioned other animal care organizations that I just don't haven't worked in, but I believe that it's very similar. But like,
yeah,
it's all day. Like, you come in,
yeah,
most of the time you walk in the door, and someone has something to put in your lap, and you walk out the end of the day, when either the doors close or the next shift comes on, and you can kind of finish up, again, most of the people I know are like beyond their shift, because especially
mhm,
that, on the doctor side, you have to write up your records. And you might, if it's a busy day, you might not have time to do that while it's all
yeah,
happening. So then you're doing that.
yeah,
You've worked your shift, and now you might have a couple hours of all your documentation, and doing your records. So it's truly like a physically exhausting
yeah,
day. And the thing is, like, we uh, there's this feeling, and I don't think it's a real, but I know it's a real feeling across the industry, is that if I don't do it, no one will.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I've had that feeling myself. I've had that conversation. Like, I have shifted my life. I haven't left veterinary medicine, but I have shifted my life a lot because of the things we're talking about, and
yeah,
prioritizing my family and things. But I still have very, very close friends that are, work full time. They're other surgeons that are, they do a lot of on call. And it's like, I had a conversation with one of them not long ago, and she's like, well, sometimes I have to do these cases even if I'm not on call, because whatever, a million reasons. And it's like, well, if I don't do it, then they have to drive to this other hospital. And I'm like, okay,
mm,
that's not,
yeah,
that's not you. That's not on you. I was like,
yeah,
because if you leave your kids to go help,
yeah,
like, who's being mom to your kids when you walk, like, it's just, you're always saying no to something. and,
mm,
and I think it's like, there's these, the days often just don't end. And so I I
Yeah. Yeah.
kind of going on and on and on, but that energy thing that you mentioned, phrasing it that way
Mm.
is like so so profound to me in like just
Right.
I've never having thought of it that way. So I appreciate
Yeah.
that frame.
Well, I appreciate the depth. So, first of all, I appreciate you coming back to it and adding just the real life depth to it, right? In those really specific examples. And if I was just to maybe add another piece to this, I often think about this idea of the energy expenditure. Well, first, we're not actually, as human beings, designed to be able to withstand being in that on position for the number of hours that people are. This is almost a manipulation of the nervous system, and we are now seeing people paying the price. That really is at the crux of the work that I do, is using a nervous system health approach to understanding professional quality of life. So what I mean by that is, if you just imagine for a moment two light switches. You've got one that has an on and off switch, and the second one is a dimmer. Right now, we know where people are at. People are in that chronic state of, as soon as you said it, as soon as I get to work, even probably before, right? My head's
Yeah,
already
right.
spinning and thinking about all the
Ready.
things.
You start thinking about the next day at the end of the day before. I mean, it
The
doesn't, you don't.
exactly. There's no, for a lot of people, there's not those hard, clear stops. So, okay, now let's imagine you've got the physical, emotional, mental, the cognitive energy loads that you're carrying because you are never knowing what's coming through the door, what you're responding to. Obviously, if you're in a merge, if you're in a shelter setting, your on switch is even more tightly stuck because your nervous system is bracing for what's the next emergency.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself, I mean, we can't stop it. It's the nature of any type of high stress work. And I get that. But what I'm seeing with my clients is that when they get home, one of two things is usually happening. Earlier, I kind of gave you the simplistic example of I go straight to the off position, which means I've got nothing left to give. I'm crashing and burning. But I think for some people, if not a lot, there is still that mental on position. And what that looks like is I can't shut off my thinking brain.
Mhm.
And then I'm having a hard time falling asleep, or I'm waking up at 3 a.m. and this won't shut off. And this is what high stress environments, and then sometimes you add that trauma exposure to it, does to the nervous system. It keeps us in this state of hypervigilance. A lot of the work that I'm doing with people is because we can't change the fact that it's the nature of the work. It's going to stay like this unless it takes a miracle to overhaul the system. I'm working with a lot of people to use the analogy of a dimmer switch, which is I may not get 15 minutes or even 20 minutes to eat my lunch. Can I get 30 seconds to take 5 sips of water and maybe 2 bites of food? My senses are being massively stimulated through sight, sound, touch, and smell. All four are present in any animal care organization. Okay, I wish I could go take 5 minutes to sit in the bathroom and close my eyes and do nothing. Who has 5 minutes in this type of an environment? Could I take 15 seconds to just close my eyes? Right? So we're working at how do you honor the nervous system so that we are not constantly at the mercy of these high stress environments. And it's hard work, but this is the path that I have found to be really effective. And I notice a lot of change when I take that nervous system health approach. Um, Not just with my clients, but actually training entire organizations on this. So some of my clients, it's like I'm coming in there from leadership, CEO, to every type of frontline staff, they're getting a nervous system education training because that's where we have a bit of power. We're actually able to reclaim a little bit back. If we understand how our physiology works, we understand the physiology of our patients, right? And we
Right.
would never dare imagine allowing a dog to stay in that on position for 12 hours a day. We know that it would be detrimental to that dog's health. And we're no different. We're animals too, right?
Yeah.
We've got the same autonomic nervous systems. And so it's these slow, steady shifts are at least one area where I do start to notice a little bit of an impact.
Yeah. And I mean, I can give you a real life personal example of that sort of always on switch for that, that you're, you know, and wish I had known you when I was still doing this. But one of the as a surgeon, you're on call. Like it's hard to
Yeah,
find a job that you don't have any on call. And I don't know I don't know why this happened, but it seemed like the older I got, the longer I had been in the field, the harder it was for me to shut it off. Like oddly enough,
yeah,
and so my last job that I did on call, we would basically rotate every third week. So you would take a week at a time. So I would, and for people that don't know, like if you get called in the night and you're there doing surgery all night, it doesn't mean you get the next day off. So it's
yeah,
kind of, I don't, I'm sure this is probably similar in human medicine or other fields, but just to paint that picture. But the problem with me is, and I presume other people, is when I was on call, I wouldn't sleep anyway because I would
exactly.
be anticipating being on call. So it
Yes.
actually, I
Yeah,
got to the point where I was like, I wish I'd just get called in because I would at least make some
yeah,
money. I'm not
yeah,
sleeping either way, so I
yep,
might as well get called in and have
yeah,
something to show for that lack of sleep. But then by the end of so then I'd have that week like that, and then I would be so exhausted after a week of like not really sleeping that I was minimally functional the next week. And then it wasn't until like the start of that third week where I would start to feel like a normal person again. But then a few days before it was time to go back on call, I would start to get anxious
yeah,
about it again. And it was like
yeah,
that cycle is probably the
yes.
biggest reason why I left like that W-2 hospital setting, because I was just
Mm,
like it was I felt like it was killing me. Like not, I'm probably not literally, but it just I felt bad all the time, and I was like, I,
yeah,
I just can't because I couldn't shut it off. I could not be on call and not be thinking about, oh, I might get woken up in the middle of the night. So instead of getting woken up in the middle of the night, I just be awake in the middle of the night, laying there,
yeah,
hoping that I don't get called in, or maybe hoping that I do because I was awake. I don't even know. But it was
hmm,
that was a very real thing that like impacted me a lot. And like I had young kids. I have young kids. Like it was just that all of that, it all tied together. And it was like,
hmm,
I don't know what to do but to get out of a scenario where I have to do this. And so that was kind of I know what you're talking about. Like people get to that, you get home, you're at that burnout point, and it's like I just it was I could never stop thinking about being on call, even when I wasn't on call for like 2 more weeks. I'm like, I better sleep
hmm,
all this week because I've got I know what's
yeah,
coming. And it was just so I completely can relate to kind of what
yeah,
that picture that you're painting.
yeah. Yeah, and I hear this unfortunately often, if not very, very frequently. This idea that even, to use one specific example from that, let's say, I don't know, I'm on, making this up, but I'm on 4 days and I'm off three. For most of the people that I work with, when it comes to the first 2 days are just spent in recovery,
Mm-hmm.
right? That like I can't get off the sofa, I don't have the energy to muster up anything. And then maybe on that last day, I'm going to start to run my errands, and I have lost count with how many people I have spoken to where that back to work dread starts
Mm-hmm.
to kick in that
Yeah.
day before. And then there you go. There's the cycle. And are there ways to interrupt it? Yeah, there absolutely are. And I think it's never foolproof and it's not always perfect. But I think what I'm really coming to see is that we're not appreciating some of these nuances when we're talking about things like mental health and well-being in the profession, but we're not really adapting. Well, first off, we're not actually naming this for what it is. It is a high stress, high trauma exposed environment. And if we agree that it is those two things, then the organizations we work with actually do have a bit of a responsibility to be able to, at bare minimum, provide us with some support to be able to mitigate the impacts of that. We're not asking our employers to help with our personal mental health. What we're saying is if the stress and the trauma exposure is inherent to the job, then an employer actually has some responsibility to be paying attention to that. And that to me is the shift that we need to be making. within VetMed, but actually framing that this is not just, hey, people, we're going to throw some money at you for CE or, a little bit of benefit so that you can self-care your way out of this. That's not going to cut it. People are going to continue to be in this hamster wheel of like, and the more responsibility you place on the individual to figure it out and then it doesn't work, the more that individual starts to feel like they're failing and that they're not doing something right. But it really is this bigger systemic issue.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And I that's why I think these conversations and what you do are so important because it's not really talked about. And I mean, I think that there's a generational shift
Yeah.
to towards even just recognizing things like mental health. Like
Yeah.
these were not things that got talked about when I don't know, really until very recently. Like I actually
Yeah.
feel like COVID caused a big shift here, at least in the veterinary world. And I, I think part of it is like generationally, the younger generations are more in tune with it, or are recognizing sometimes to the sometimes us old folks get a little frustrated with some of it, and I will again admit to being probably part of that problem at times. But what happened in COVID was, things shut down. A lot of things shut down, and everybody was scared. So there's like you have the stress of that fear anyway. But then
Yeah.
a really weird thing happened, and it seemed like everybody who wasn't going to work anymore or whatever decided to get a pet. And it was all of a sudden there was literally twice as much work to do in an environment where it was really even harder to get the work done because you couldn't, like, clients weren't coming into the hospital. We're all supposed to be distanced. Everybody's wearing masks. Like it, wearing a mask changed my life zero because I'm a surgeon. I wear I wear masks regularly. It was like I was like this doesn't bother me at all. But a lot of the logistics around it made what we did even even harder to um, I mean, it's like we've talked about sort of the grief counseling side of it. Like, imagine
Mm-hmm.
having to euthanize someone's pet and they can't come in the
Mm-hmm.
building.
That's it.
Like, you're FaceTiming with them, and I know
Yeah.
this happened with people too. I have friends
Yeah.
who's lost
Yeah.
family members in COVID and had to essentially like grieve through FaceTime,
Yeah.
which is just a crazy thing to think about. But like the but but what happened was there was too much work, and at first, again, like being a little bit older generation, like I was like, we what I saw was ERs started to shut down, and I was like, you can't shut down an ER. That's not a thing. Like that was my initial thought. I was
Right.
like, you can't stop. It's an ER. Like these are emergencies, and it was like it took me a while, and I talked to friends who were like, I don't understand this. We never would have shut down the ER. But like, it took me a while to recognize the reality of kind of we just can't do it all, um, and how to. I'm I'm not sure I ever figured out how to appropriately deal
Mm.
with it. I just kind of got out
See,
doing
and I think what you're raising there is like such an important bit. Like if we even just pause on the COVID-19 pandemic, that is what we would consider by definition a collective trauma.
it. Yeah.
And why collective? Because there were, well, in this instance, the entire world was impacted by it. But if we think just really simplistic, like from a simplistic frame point or frame here, trauma meaning a rupture to safety. And there were massive ruptures to safety. We were trying to keep ourselves safe and alive, the people we loved, our animals, our colleagues, like the list goes on. But I think that the couple of things that from what you're saying that I think are really important is, as with any trauma, the event may end, but it doesn't mean that the lived experience now is like, oh, it's just back to normal. Because, Dr. Gabor Mate talks about trauma as it's not in the event, it's what happens inside of us as a result of what happens to us. And if we're thinking about COVID, believe it or not, at least a few times a month, it's coming up in my conversations with clients.
Mhm.
And not just the memories of what happened, but how it is shaping my bandwidth today. What I'm hearing over and over again is I am so changed out. Don't make me change more. Because the amount of change as systems and as people we were required to figure out in such a short amount of time was more than the human body is designed to be able to
Yeah.
hold. And not only was it a change, it was, hey, we're changing this. And then tomorrow, guess what? This change isn't working. So now we're pivoting to something else.
Yeah.
And it created this rate of change that people I don't believe have recovered from, particularly within this field, right? And the change continues. Maybe like I'm done. And so when we're seeing workplace behaviors of people looking like they're checked out, it's so easy to attribute that to laziness or people not caring. But again, it's this subconscious system that's happening where people are like, I cannot take in anymore. There's no
Mhm.
time for recovery, let alone healing.
Yeah.
As a society, let alone a profession, how have we recovered and healed from the pandemic? We haven't. And in fact, one could argue that the onslaught has gone even worse since the pandemic in a number of ways.
Yeah, that's a great. I mean, yeah, nobody nobody knew what to do. Nobody had faced something like this. Like nobody knew what the right thing was to do, and everybody was just trying to figure it out. And it's like, yeah, you have a different depending on how big of a company you worked for. I worked for a corporate veterinary company at the time, and it was like you'd get this email or whatever, like we're gonna do it this way now, and it's like, well, where's that coming from? But like, and people get upset. Well, we just did this, we did, and it's like, but the reality is nobody knew what the right thing to do
Nobody
was.
knew.
So it was like
Yeah,
everybody was just guessing and trying to figure it out.
yeah.
And yeah, all the change that happened. But then what was interesting is at that going into it, people were dying. Like there was a lot of lost life at the beginning of COVID, and so going into it, it was almost like those changes were almost easier because there was that like impending consequence of if you didn't. But
Yes.
the change back has was harder. Like some people liked not seeing clients. Like there
Mm-hmm.
were
Exactly.
there was
Yeah.
a lot of a lot of things where it was like, hey, this is actually nicer. We don't have to we don't have it's like one piece of your job got a little bit simpler in that. And so the going back, I think, was almost equally traumatic and dragged out longer
Mm.
because not everybody went back to whatever normal is. Like not everybody went back at the same speed, and so then you start to have people complaining like, oh well, this hospital let us in, and this hospital didn't make me wear a mask, and this hospital
Mm.
whatever, or I can go to my own doctor and go in the building, just like all this stuff. And it was like, so then you're getting bombarded with, are you doing this right? Doing a thing that still nobody knows how to do. Are you doing it right? And so,
Yeah.
um, yeah, that's an interesting thought that I again I love the way you frame things because I hadn't thought about the impact of just the changes that happened and like
Mm.
adapting to that
Yeah.
in real time quickly.
And as you were talking, I couldn't help but think of the word survival, that survival made sense for a pandemic, right? That's the
Right.
mode we're in. But if we take that bit of survival and hold it in this larger context of a profession that one could argue has been surviving already for a long time,
Yep.
and I would argue in many instances that survival continues. We don't have, if you look at even just the measurements by which we would assess a professional quality of life within a workplace setting, we're
Yeah.
in survival mode. And people are not in that state of, generally speaking, of thriving. And I really believe that three things have to be ingrained to get us to that point. We need to have leadership that is understanding like this larger frame of psychological health and safety. They need to be able to see the role that they play. Can't change bad things from happening. You can't change the fact that there's going to be stressors in the workplace. That's not what we mean. But psychological health and safety does provide a frame to assess where are areas we actually do have some control to not make life so challenging for our people.
Yeah.
We got to really strengthen the way our teams are interacting through interpersonal effectiveness, through conflict resolution, through debriefing, all that fun stuff. And we need individual workers to be have them like to have the knowledge, the skills, and the tools to be able to manage and mitigate the stress and trauma impacts. And so right now, I think a lot of what we're doing in the mental health space is we're throwing spaghetti at the wall and we're hoping something is going to stick. We don't have a strategy. We don't have clear metrics. We don't have clear goals. And it's like, oh, well, we brought in somebody to do a 1 hour webinar. Yay. I'm at the point now where I'm like almost like I can't do any more of these 1 hour webinars because they're not moving the needle in any type of a substantial way. In what universe do we realize that we've got this massive challenge ahead of us, but we have no strategy and no direction?
Hmm. Yeah. It's, I would imagine, I mean, you say the 1 hour webinar is like the idea of a webinar is to go one to many, right? Like that's the whole strategy behind it is like I can talk to, but I would think this is not the same. Like not every person is experiencing these things the same way. And like some people, this is so funny. Like had similar, but like almost like a joking sort of conversation about this yesterday with a friend of mine. But like some people are, maybe it's because of the way they grew up, but like some people are very equipped to go into survival mode in a way, like they've experienced. I'm not saying that's a good thing. Like I think some people have maybe grown up with childhood traumas, and so survival mode is feels more normal to them. And it was interesting because this is like the joke part of the story with my friend was like, someone would in a zombie apocalypse, like some people would just give up and roll over, and but some people would be those fighters that are gonna like, no, I'm gonna stay
Mm,
alive. And I there's this is something I will never forget from COVID was the first time I went grocery shopping after. So with I had a my son was like a year and a half old
yeah,
when everything shut down, and so the first time, so I was essential. I was going to work, so it was like my wife and son are going to stay in the house. Like that's it. You're in the house. You stay here. I'm the only one that goes out in the world, and so
mm,
I it shifted. Like I would go to work, but also I was the one that had to do the grocery shopping, like all of that outside of the stuff, outside of the house stuff. First time I went to the grocery store, most of the aisles were empty, and I'll like that vision, like I will see that clearly in my
yeah,
mind forever, because like she sent me with the list. Like I hadn't been the one doing the grocery shopping. She sent me with the list, and it was like I walked down the aisle and I'm like, it's not here. And I had this thing of like like I have to feed my family, and I'm going, but for me it was
yeah,
like whatever that takes. Like I was immediately like, okay, like into that, survival zombie apocalypse mode. Like I will do
yeah.
whatever I have to get them taken care of. And so, but I think some people will get in that scenario and just like I don't know what to do. I can't deal with this, like that sort of thing. It's
Mm,
kind of a the zombie apocalypse thing is kind of a silly anecdote, but like that day in the grocery store was very real, and something that'll like I'll go to like I'll die remembering that. Like that's a very clear vision, and that was
hmm,
5 years ago now. So it's kind of
yeah,
uh, the reaction to this stuff where a webinar is a great resource for people, but also like you got to figure half those people are looking at this completely different than the other half,
mm,
and how they would
yeah.
handle those scenarios.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And I'm not trying to be facetious in the 1 hour webinar. Like, I totally agree that any type of education is still better than none at all. But just listening to you speak about this, it also reminds me that as we're using the example of the pandemic, trauma exposure happens for a lot of people on the job, in the job,
Hmm.
frequently,
Yeah.
depending on the type of work you're doing. I see it really pronounced in the shelter work that I do, just because of the nature of the work they do, right? I mean, if there's surrenders and the types of euthanasias are often very different.
Yeah.
I see it in the zoo work that I do. We're talking about trying to save species, and the massive sort of pressure of conservation work. But I suppose where I'm going with this is the lessons I think that we're able to really personalize from COVID. What if we take that now and take that right into the workplace? I think there's a couple of points that one is trauma exposure is part of the work. What we are not saying is, oh no, trauma's bad. That's not what we're saying. What we are saying, though, if you think about the pandemic and the impacts to this day that it still has, then it allows us to more easily see that the trauma exposure we have in our workplaces can have very similar impacts.
Hmm.
But it's highly personal. To
Yeah.
your point, like you can take one euthanasia that's gone wrong. I think Dr. Kathleen Cooney talks about this as a dysphanesia. So you can take a euthanasia that doesn't go according to plan and maybe has a traumatic nature to it. You could have five people in that room, and I don't know, maybe there's three techs, there's one doctor, there's the client, and all five people walk away from that experience, the same experience, feeling very differently.
Hmm.
Maybe two people are like, yeah, that wasn't that pleasant, but they're able to shake it off and move on. And there's another tech who is having nightmares about it for the next week. And this is the inherent nature of trauma, is it's this very personal experience that is shaped. It is, to your point, it is shaped by what were my most earliest attachment styles with my caregivers? What were my formative years like when it came to emotional stability and security? And that's a whole nother podcast, right? But those
Yeah,
parts do influence us.
we talk for hours on that, but yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's a real thing, a real thing that people have different experiences shaping
Yes.
the way they will,
Approach the
feel
work
after something.
and
Yeah.
show up.
Hmm.
And this is where sometimes I have really strong opinions on the rhetoric. I believe it's a bit of uninformed rhetoric, if I'm being really direct, on when we talk about, are there particular personality styles of veterinarians and veterinary professionals? Because I believe, I can be challenged on this, that even the notion of personality is often lacking a trauma informed lens. Like you want to take one of the core personality types, for example, of what's often called neuroticism. I want to understand that person's life history to understand why these behaviors are showing up. Because what we know about trauma is that because it's actually really good news, because the trauma is not in the event and it's in the inside experience, then I can actually heal and grow from it too. So let's not treat personality as this fixed state. Because I remember growing up, I have a really rich trauma history. And people who would meet me, if you were to look at the personality styles, I would be labeled as neurotic. And so that, for example, just one example, if you wanted to meet the telltale worrier, that was me. Look at me today, not at all.
Hmm.
Because through my own healing journey, I have managed to figure out some parts of personality might be a little bit more static. But, anyways, I can go off on a tangent on this. But what I'm trying to say is that when you really start to understand both how personal and workplace related trauma impact us from the inside out, your whole lens of looking at the world shifts.
Yeah.
And if we think about a lot of the workplace behaviors that we hear in vet med right now, that people label as toxic, the gossiping, the fighting, the interrupting, the condescending behaviors, the withdrawal, the not avoiding conflict. I'm willing to bet a whole lot of money that for a lot of people, those are parts of their trauma histories. And at bare minimum, if not trauma, then they're survival stress stories.
Yeah.
But we're not
Yeah.
thinking of it that way.
I agree. I think it. Yeah. I mean, workplace. This again another probably very large topic, but I mean, like workplace
Yeah.
dynamics are, I think, flawed in a lot of especially the larger the organization gets, because the larger the organization gets, you have more people, which actually means you have a more varied, uh, whatever personality
Yeah.
pool. And but the larger the organization, the more um, standardized everything becomes, and so it's like those two things are in opposition of each other, and so it's hard to be. Uh, I think it. What I noticed was it seemed like most of those like standardized mandates just were a response to one person doing something one way,
Mm.
and it was like, well, why? Like, why isn't that addressed at the? I mean,
Mm.
it's kind of like the. I think this started with Dunkin' Donuts, but I might be biased because I'm from Boston, and that's like Dunkin' Donuts is on every corner. But it's the whole thing like where a cup of coffee would had to now has to have the label of this is hot
Hot. Yeah. Yeah.
because one person burned themselves on hot coffee, but like everybody knows coffee is hot, and it's just kind of like reacting to that's a different thing because it's probably just a litigation issue, but like
Mm.
the point is that making some blanket response to one individual occurrence to me is like very counterproductive. It just
Mm.
doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think I guess I'm agreeing with you in your point that the workplace dynamics and like labeling things doesn't make sense. It's like how
Context matters. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean
Yeah.
as a leader in an organization, like that's your job. That is your job is to figure out how to tie it all together, and I think that
Yeah.
that often unfortunately doesn't happen. But
Yeah.
Angie, we're getting close to time here. I think we could have like many different podcast
Oh yeah.
episodes around all of these
Yeah.
topics, but I want to ask you before we jump off. The name of my podcast is Know Your Why.
Mm.
So, I mean, we've
Mm.
talked about a ton of valuable things here, but what is your why? What's kind of driving you, inspiring you to keep doing the work that you do?
Mm. It's a great question. I think it's a couple. There's two main whys. One is, I mean, it's probably the most obvious, but my love for animals runs really, really deep. But I know I am not cut out to work directly with animals. So the next best way for me to be able to support animals is by supporting the people who support animals. Because
Mm.
I know when people are better taken care of, our animals are also better taken care of. And I think another bit that has become really clear to me is I spent most of my life walking through the world in survival mode and living a life where I didn't believe I was seen, heard, understood, maybe even valued. And although that is part of the human experience, and I'm not coming here trying to save anyone from anything, I do know the power of creating spaces for people to be able to better understand themselves, to learn to better connect with themselves, so that they can better connect with the people, their environments, and their animals around them. And to me, it is a really big honor and privilege to be able to hold that space for people so that they can self explore and even begin, dare I say, heal some of the patterns that have kept them in survival for most of their life.
Yeah, I love that. And and you said you love animals, but couldn't work in the profession directly.
Mm.
Interesting. This is another interesting sort of perspective shift that I have had that relates to that. In that, so I I think that the veterinary industry in general is sort of broken, and
Mm.
for many of the reasons that we talked about. I think there's an underlying theme here, and um, I've said this before on the podcast. Like I don't, this is no secret, but like I don't want my kids to go into veterinary medicine
Mm.
because of a lot of the things we talked about. The you're I'm not qualified to help anyone with their mental health, but the way I look at it now is a lot of what I do is around education and financial education, investing, and all of that. And
Yeah.
I think that my thought process here is same as what you're doing. Like the more vets or people in the veterinary community that we help, the more animals that can be helped as a result of
Yes.
that. So it's like
Yeah.
helping from like I can only do there is only a limited amount of surgeries that I can do. I can help individual animals by doing surgery, and I do that, and I love that I can do that. But if I can help other people in the profession stay in the profession longer, enjoy their jobs,
That's
create
it.
an environment where more vets want to come in than are leaving, which it's the opposite right
Yeah.
now. Like that's that helps more animals than me just doing as many surgeries as I possibly can do. And I think
Yeah.
what you're doing is a very it fits in that category as well, right? Helping people in the profession stay in the profession because there's been a lot that have left, and helping people understand how to manage and mitigate some of the stressors and traumas
Yeah.
that are just a real part of it. So I think
Yeah.
that type of work is extremely important. Um, with that, when people hear this and they want to connect with you, what's the best way?
Great question. Feel free to follow me on Instagram. My handle is Veterinary Wellbeing Coach, and I'm also happy for people to reach out via email. They can send me a message to Angie at angieaurora.com, and we'd be happy to explore any parts of this conversation that people are feeling called to.
Okay, perfect. Well, we'll get all that in the show notes so people can find you.
Beautiful.
And I just want to say, thank you. So I truly appreciate you being on. I think this conversation is, like I said, it's not maybe the most common type of conversation we have on this podcast, but it's
Yeah.
incredibly important and impactful for people to hear this. And uh, I'm I'm a part of the veterinary world, and I think a lot of my listeners are probably a part of the veterinary world as well. And so I think hopefully they'll take the steps to reach out and connect with you and find some ways to just feel better in doing the truly important work that they're already doing. So I genuinely thank you very much for being here, Angie.
Thank you. It was a great conversation.
Folks listening, make sure you connect. We'll have, like I said, we'll have Angie's contact information in the show notes. Please like, rate, and review the show so we can continue to get more great guests. And as always, thank you for listening.
Hey there, I am Dr. Jason Balara, and this is the Know Your Why podcast, where we explore the why behind success. Every week, I meet with real estate investors, veterinary entrepreneurs, mindset coaches, authors, and fitness professionals to uncover their why and how it drives them on the winding road to success. What is your why?